Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode, I think it's 16, I'm not quite
Fif-
sure, of Free
15,
Kiwi,
15, episode 15.
15. So we are the podcast for New Zealand thinking, free Kiwi thinking and New Zealand ideas. Trying to get my own slogan right. And today we are delighted to have Dane Giraud, who is a comedian, a writer, and he is also a member of the New Zealand Free Speech Union. So welcome, Dane.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So I actually wanted to start out just asking you about your career, really, because I think you've written for the screen, you've written for various sort of TV shows that have done quite well, and you're also a comedian. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe how you found your way through that environment to the sort of free speech movement?
Well, to talk about how I ended up in the free speech movement, I think I need to go back even earlier than my TV career to when I was a punk rock guitarist. So I was always very interested in controversial material. And our band we were sort of like the New York Dolls, to be honest. You know, we were cross-dressers and playing really hard rock and so forth, and would, had quite a sort of shocking, in-your-face stage show. I don't know, I've always been interested in controversial art. And then when the band broke up, I didn't want to rely on four other guys anymore. So I moved into acting. I went to drama school, the Unitec Performing Arts School. I went there and then worked in the industry as an actor for a couple of years and did a lot of theater and stuff. And then went behind the camera when I made a digital feature that I co-wrote in order to act in. And that was sort of a nightmare in post-production. So I ended up having to save it by going behind the camera, well, edit suite at that point, and sort of developed a, just written, most of my lines because the director was English was a second language. And so, I had a credit at that point and everything. And then I started having children and acting as a part-time job. So I fully embraced the writer and development and director too, side of the business, and did that. So I worked in documentary first for, a good 10 years, I'd say. And, again, it was about, I would interview, I worked a lot with minorities and would try to, and I was quite interested by working with minorities was interesting for me because, and I think it's relevant to what happens today and where I because I have a very specific angle when it comes to the whole free speech debate because I'm Jewish. And I did find, speaking to Muslim communities, people, survivors from the Congolese wars and so forth, that there's an establishment representation of minorities, and then there are the minority groups. When you start really digging into some of their stories, I mean, I would find a lot of similarities coming from a smaller community myself, but also there's incredible diversity within these groups that, the Human Rights Commission and even government, to be fair, aren't that interested in representing. There are certain narratives that come out of those communities that are just a bit more politically expedient for them, I think. So that was interesting. So I was really quite fascinated with looking for the, the more unpredictable stories, which, they shouldn't be unpredictable because, groups are diverse. But of course, they would have been to a lot of mainstream New Zealanders. So that was really interesting. And then I left. I was with one company for many years and got a bit safe. It got a bit safe. So I left, and then, my background had been acting and drama and so forth, and comedy at drama school and everything. And then I put a lot more effort into comedy and such, and had a hit show, Find Me a Maori Bride, which really took off. And after that, that was it. It was like I was a comedy writer, after doing everything else for all this time. I was a comedy writer. And, I've found that, like in our business, which is so unpredictable, you really got to, and I say this to younger students when I'm talking to them, I say, you'll end up where the industry wants you. It's like a version of the, you make plans and God laughs type thing. It's like, I may have thought when I was 20, 23 or 24 at drama school, I'm going to be Robert De Niro, but now I'm writing comedy. And that's because the industry decided, hey, you go over there. We want you over there now. You've been over here. Now go over there. Who knows where I'll be in 10 years' time? I could be writing anything.
I certainly know that feeling. I've been, in my life, I've sort of moved from one thing to another a little bit as well, perhaps against my own wishes to a degree, but it seems to have worked out that I've ended up where I need to be. But there's a couple of things that you said there that I'd like to pick up on, Dane, in the context of maybe what's happened in the last few years with the rise of what we might call cancel culture and also kind of strong identitarianism. The first is in relation to what you were saying about identity groups being diverse, which of course they are. And it seems to me an irony of the current political moment that purports to represent minority identities and to be arguing for their equality and so on. And yet it seems to play into stereotyping them actually as having a kind of monolithic point of view. Have you found that with the way Jews are represented, and how would you see that in the context of your thinking?
Yeah, I think it happens to all minority groups. I think Jews can be represented that way. I mean, we're incredibly diverse. Like for instance, when it came to, because submissions are still going in at this point, at the point that we're recording this for the proposed new hate speech laws, it struck me as not very honest if a Jewish organization was to write a submission one way or the other, to be fair, because we are so split on it.
Yes.
We're split. It's like, and obviously I'm in the I'm a free speech advocate, so I'm going to be pro that, but I in good conscience, I could not force that on the rest of my community. You
couldn't say you represent the Jewish community in your views on hate speech, or presumably much else apart from perhaps some religious doctrine, although even there might be a huge amount of diversity.
Well, that's right. So I mean, my advice would be that we all do independent, we all do personal submissions, really. I just don't think it would be right for us to really be putting in submissions in the name of a Jewish organization one way or the other, really. I think we got to play it straight when it comes to that. And it only helps us, I believe, if, if the wider community understands that we're that diverse. I mean, to me, that's what we should be aiming for, really, as a solution to racism for a start.
Yeah.
Hate speech laws, I don't know what they're a solution to. I still can't work out what they're meant to solve. But no, I do find, and I got to say, as cynical as this is going to sound, now I'm sort of involved in this sort of advocacy and working at a level where I'm sort of engaging with a lot of government, with the government or whoever. They are very, like groups like the Human Rights Commission, for instance, very, very selective in who they will speak to from minority communities. It's not necessarily, they don't necessarily have an open door policy when it comes to that.
Do you think they're looking to to talk to people who will confirm their narrative about those identity groups?
100%, 100%. And I would say that goes for a lot of media outlets too. Like, I won't name names, but there are certain community spokespeople who have next to no community buy-in, but they'll be writing articles every 2 weeks or every week even, they become the voice for, projects like the hate speech laws. And it's like if you really, drill down into it, they might have like 80 followers in their organization or something, really a pittance. Yeah. So no, I find that's true. And even if you look at the research from a group like the Human Rights Commission, like I've had to go in putting our submission together. I went through all of their stuff, all of their documents. A lot of us did, because we've got lawyers and all sorts of people. So it's good to have all those different views coming at it. That they were talking about the cumulative harm of say hate speech, right? And and I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, and because I think about my own reactions to anti-Semitism. I'm more inclined to stand up to it, and quite directly. I will speak back to it. A lot of it could be to do with my background. I come from South Auckland. It was a little rough and tumble for me there when I was younger. So I'm not really a shrinking violet when it comes to that stuff. And I know not everyone's going to respond the way I am, and then that's fine. But we were only really getting, I noticed from there, documents, literature that seemed to be suggesting that it's just, it's just all harm, when people are exposed to hateful rhetoric and so forth. But of course, there are studies that say that, it builds resilience for people, and a lot of subjects in these studies have even responded by saying that I felt stronger having stood up to a racist or racism. But you're only going to get that one side of the coin from them. They are going to present minorities as sort of really, really fragile, really vulnerable, and sort of not able to look after themselves unless there was some serious state intervention, which I find kind of morally reprehensible, to be perfectly honest with you.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we'll come back to this later, probably, when we might talk about the a YouTube clip from the Religious Diversity Centre of Aotearoa, New Zealand, with various academics defending the new hate speech legislation. And one of the things that came out of that for me was their very strong emphasis on the importance of affording dignity to minorities. And I have no argument with them about that. But what you're just saying there is actually, to afford full dignity, you have to not see people as being weak or victims, but actually able to stand up for themselves. I guess there's a line, of course. We probably wouldn't want to argue that just because some people are made more resilient by exposure to racism and so on, that we ought to tolerate necessarily in all ways racist speech. As you say, we want to push back against it, but maybe making it illegal is not the way to go, because that seems to actually perhaps inadvertently undermine the dignity of minorities and their agency in standing up to things for themselves.
Well, the term protection is an interesting one. It's like, once again, I think about myself, and it's like, how do I want the state to protect me as a Jew, right? As a citizen, I want certain protections. I want the police to come, if my house is being burgled and so forth. But specifically as a Jew, how do I want them to protect me? I don't want them to fight my battles in a way. I think it's important that we drive the counter narratives for many reasons. For one reason is that anti-Semitism is not like other forms of racism. Islamophobia is not like other forms of bigotry too. I mean, Islam's not really a race, so but even though there can be racial elements for many bigots who are going after Muslims, but it's not so simple, It's like the way I'm going to be affected by racism is going to be very different to how maybe a Polynesian would be, like the rhetoric, the way people come at us, the dog whistles, the way they bury it is going to be very specific. So we need to drive our own narratives on that, really, for there to be true awareness and true education. Because I don't actually believe that the Human Rights Commission and groups like that understand anti-Semitism. I think they've even I won't say promoted it, but they've what's the word I'm looking for? They've allowed it to slip by, and they're not as prepared to do anything about it as they are like some other forms of racism, and they have their arguments to get around that. But again, that's them. We should be driving this. And of course, back to the diversity thing, I could come out and say, I believe this is anti-Semitic and I want to talk about it and I want to debate it. And then, there'll always be another Jew who will say, I think you're wrong. And that's fine as well,
Yes, perhaps if there's anything that we can characterize Jewish people in terms of, it's a certain robustness of intellectual debate.
Well, I think you're wrong. Could
Right?
be the subheading of the history of the Jewish people.
Yeah.
You've touched on something very, very important. Really, it's at the essence of this debate over hate speech, and this is the idea that speech can itself constitute a kind of violence or harm. And I think this has become quite common fairly recently, and we've seen it indeed in the government's comments on the new hate speech proposals and in the Justice Minister's comments. And I think one reply to that would be along the lines that you've already laid out, which is supported by a lot of psychology. I mean, we had John Haidt, the American psychologist, on this podcast recently, and he stresses that there's a lot of evidence in psychology that you're meant to sort of avoid avoidance. You can get into your head the idea that things are harmful, which are not really harmful. I mean, or not as harmful as you might think. It can actually be worse for you to start obsessing about these things and believe they're more harmful than they are. And in fact, it seems like building resilience is about being in that sweet spot where you're challenged, but it's not, you're not actually put in danger. So, I mean, that's one way you could go with this, but one way you could respond to this idea that speech is violence. The other response, I think, is to say, well, what does the world look like if we start treating speech as violence? And I think we have an answer to that because we've sort of run this experiment, actually. We started running it in American liberal arts colleges. And what happens, and we've seen this very clearly, is that when you start treating speech as violence, less speech happens. And it becomes very easy to shut down speech using this rationale. And so we've seen this wave of deplatformings and people's books being unpublished and articles being retracted. And it's interesting, we've seen that starting to happen in New Zealand too, with Jim Flynn's book being dropped by the publisher, and John Brash being deplatformed at Massey. And it's a very similar set of ideas behind this. And the recent interview with Chris Fafoy, I thought was very interesting for many reasons. But one of the things that I wanted to pick up on, and you talked a little bit about this on the Free Speech Union podcast with David Kuman, and I haven't seen anybody else pick up this point. There was a point in that interview where I think Tova O'Brien said, well, is it right that you could get a longer time in jail for something you say under these proposals than for common assault? And the Justice Minister said, well, hate speech might have many victims, because if you abuse Muslims or something with your speech, then there are many, many victims of that. So it's very interesting because he's using that term, using the term victims in quite a strong sense, like as if it's clearly just as bad to have someone say something mean about you as it is to be, punched in the face or smacked with a metal bar or something like that. And the other implication of what Chris Fafoy said is that it seems like the more people, the larger the group that you address with your hate speech, the worse it is. And that just seems to have these implications that he might not have thought about. For example, that if you engage in hate speech against a majority group, then it's worse. So then we have to have higher penalties for abuse against white New Zealanders because there are more of them. And that, on his theory, they're harming more people than if we engage in hate speech against Muslims, which is obviously not what the government had in mind.
No, well, I guess back to what I was saying about some of the literature coming out of the Human Rights Commission, they're almost like conspiracy theories because, as you just really illustrated, if you take one more logical step, it sort of all falls down, doesn't it? It really doesn't stand up at all, just with that one extra logical step, and I think, to the point of, speech being violence, there's a lot of catastrophizing going on. Like last year, and I believe we picked up on this in that podcast episode too. There was a campaign run by the Human Rights Commission where they were talking about racist speech, right, and speech that was in, the people were using that could be deemed racist or problematic. One of them was, "Do you have any ID? Could I see some ID?" Right. Another one was, "Sorry, I just cannot pronounce your name." Right. Now, we really need to think about that. Like, no one can pronounce my name, right? It's French.
I asked about how to pronounce it just before we started recording this podcast.
And it was such a microaggression. I nearly just threw my laptop across the room.
But of course, be prosecuted immediately.
Well, yeah, you should do hard time. You should be breaking rocks for that, buddy. No,
well, actually, people ask how to spell my name all the time, so don't get me started. That's clearly,
Well, that's the thing. So it's like, it's the Giraud is the French way to pronounce it. I say Giraud because it's a bit more anglicized and people can they can say it without, because you get used to pronunciation's tough. It's like if I gave you some Hebrew right now, you'd probably struggle with some of the sounds, and because your mouth just doesn't, you're not making those sounds every day. So again, there's a little bit of science there that people are sort of overlooking as well. But if people really bought into all of these narratives that the Human Rights Commission were trying to peddle, like the idea that not being able to pronounce your name is just this massive, makes you a victim of racism, that someone asking you for ID makes you a victim of racism. I mean, where, like at a liquor store? Like when the person looks a little young, come on, I mean, it's ridiculous. And tying it back to the idea of cumulative speech causing harm, which they like to promote. I mean, they're actually trying to make minorities feel traumatized, like feel victimized. That's sort of what it comes across as to me. It's like, if you're saying to people, you are a victim potentially of racism because somebody asked you for ID, you're messing with that person's head.
It's not only messing with their head, I think it's messing with everyone's head in a way that can only be divisive. I mean, I think you're right that it talks people into a sort of victimhood status that they might not want or agree with. And it also puts other people on eggshells around minorities and makes them much more conscious of race, when actually it seems to me that the less conscious of race we are, the better.
Well, yeah, and you got to, and we have to remember that these are government departments who get funding, and they exist and continue to exist by justifying their existence. And this is where I get kind of hurt by this, because my sense is that they are happy to hurt us if it justifies their existence.
Mm.
That's really what it feels like. And I'm speaking as a minority now,
Yeah.
And I think it's about power and you know, topping up the funding and all of this sort of carry on. You know, it's like, let's put this campaign out. Look how visible we are. Let's sort of make, you know, they need victims to continue. You know, if there are no victims, you know, what would be the point? Because you've got to remember, like the current administration, you know, in the Human Rights Commission, they've got a very set agenda, and this is not conspiratorial. Because, like, you know, recently well, there's two things that really stuck out to me recently about the Human Rights Commission. When the feminist group Speak Up for Women were denied access to public venues, the Free Speech Union offered them some support, you know, putting them in the direction of lawyers, helping crowdfund, all that sort of stuff. And they won, right? Because of the Bill of Rights. It was quite a simple case, really, for the, even though the councillors thought they had the moral high ground, the judge was, you know, bound by the Bill of Rights. And he said, well, of course you can hold your talk there. They were talking about a government bill. You know, It's like, you've got to be able to speak about government policy in a public venue. How, you know, and there was no evidence that this was a hate group. He ruled and stuff and said, no, it's completely fine.
And the legal fight for those Canadians, Molyneux and Southern, who were banned from speaking in public venues in Auckland was a lot murkier, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a lot murkier, but the reason why the Free Speech Coalition at the time took it on, you know, because, you know, we're defending the principle. A lot of the people that come your way, they're detestable.
I agree with you. I'm not saying that the case was murkier in the sense that it was unclear whether they should have been banned or not, but just when the Free Speech Coalition, as it was then, ran the campaign, they had a lot more trouble in the court than you had with Speak Up for Women.
Well, that's right, but I tend to think that so like we lost the first case with the original, you know, that original case with Auckland City Council with the YouTubers. We appealed and cleaned up some of the rulings. Like one of the rulings was that because Auckland City Council sort of outsourced the management of these venues, a private company had taken them on, so therefore the Bill of Rights need not apply so much because they were now private. What's interesting about that, right, is that you got so-called progressives cheering that outcome. You know, the fact that an Auckland City Council got around the Bill of Rights. Woohoo! We got around the Bill of Rights. This is what progressives are cheering right now. I mean, this is nuts. But
that's very interesting. Actually, I kind of want to pick up the point about the Bill of Rights Act because I've just been looking. There's a blog post by Stephen Price, who's a Wellington-based media lawyer, and he defends the hate speech laws. You know, pretty intelligently. I mean, he works in media law, so he knows the law. And he thinks that these new proposals they present so many different tests that, in fact, you know, there'd be very few prosecutions. At which point you have to sort of say, well, why do you want these new laws if you don't think they're ever going to be used? But anyway, he says, one of the things he says is, well, look, there's the Bill of Rights. And so, you know, anybody who tries to prosecute somebody for hate speech under these new proposals will have to demonstrate to a court that it's quote, demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society, right? So he thinks, well, there's this provision in the Bill of Rights Act that you have to demonstrate that it's justified in a free and democratic society. So you know, spurious kind of challenges to people's ordinary political speech won't go through. But you know, we're not doing this in a vacuum. We can actually look at other examples of how these things have played out, because in the UK, there have been hate speech laws, and especially in Scotland, there have been hate speech laws. And there's a very recent case in the UK of Maya Forstater, who was an environmental researcher, and she was sacked by her employer for her basically gender-critical views, and that got taken to court. And in the initial judgment, the judge actually said no, that sacking was legal, And it all turned on this language which was established by precedent in UK law about whether her opinions were not, and I quote again, not worthy of respect in a democratic society. So Judge Taylor in the UK decided that the ideas that she was putting out, like she thinks that men and women are different and there's a biological basis to sex and things like that, he decided in that ruling that these are not worthy of respect in a democratic society. So that kind of language, in fact, as we've seen in this case in the UK, it doesn't actually provide any immovable barrier to prosecuting people for ordinary political views. Now, the last thing I should say this for completeness sake, last thing I'll say on this is that was actually eventually overturned, that judgment was appealed. But it just goes to show that in this environment where, as you say, basically all the progressives who have considerable power at this point in New Zealand culture, all the progressives are trying to sort of say that people's very kind of majority views are sort of completely kind of garbage views and not worthy of respect. These things can go through the courts, and in fact, they do so quite easily.
Well, I mean, the point I was heading towards was that the Human Rights Commission was absolutely silent on Speak Up for Women. They had nothing to say about it at all, and that silence speaks volumes, because that says to me that they would have had no problem had the Bill of Rights been completely trashed in the courts. That's what it really says to me. I mean, I don't know how else you come to any other conclusion. The other example was when Paul Hunt, the chief commissioner, was interviewed on The Nation, and Tova O'Brien threw at him the "what about Israel Folau" question, and he said, "Well, that's not for me to say." And it's like, well, I would expect you to be protecting religious freedoms. You're the Human Rights Commission, so they're not really so interested in that stuff anymore.
They don't seem to be. And
no.
Perhaps this is actually a good time to turn to some of the detail of that session from the Religious Diversity Centre we were talking about before, because there was something that really struck me that Paul Morris said fairly early in that presentation about where free speech sits in relation to other rights. And he characterized a lot of the opposition to the proposed hate speech legislation in New Zealand as being an Americanization of the issue, in particular, elevating free speech to the most important and foundational right in a democracy. And of course, he referred to the First Amendment of their constitution in that regard. But it seemed to me that is a kind of legalization of an argument that is actually much more fundamental than that. I mean, to my mind, the Americans are correct to do that, not because of any sort of legal choice, but because if we don't elevate free speech to the highest value, we will actually lose a fundamental element of open society. And I wonder if you have any comment on that. I know you've listened to that talk as well.
Yeah, no, I can't say I was too impressed with Professor Paul Morris in that session. I've heard that dignity and equality of people's argument used before, and and talking about the Americanization of it. This isn't America, and so forth. I think. Well, let's take for an example the trans debate, right?
Yep.
So now the feminist group that we had previously advised or defended Speak Up for Women had a billboard taken down in Wellington a few weeks back. I don't know if you followed that.
I do recall that, yes.
Yeah. So it was, for context for listeners, it was literally the dictionary definition of women. It was nothing more but the dictionary definition of women with no other explainer, just put on the side of a building. And people called it hateful. People are still calling it hateful. And it got taken down after there were, people complained about it. Now, the courts may agree with the people that say it's hateful. A friend of mine said, well, it's clearly discriminatory because it's saying a woman is one type of thing, right? So people are going to debate about that. So that's fine. They're going to debate about that, and debate. I got no problem with debate, right? So that's fine. But if the person who authored that billboard, she doesn't even have to go through the courts. If she was visited by a police officer and there was a knock on the door and the policeman said, just watch yourself.
Yes.
Isn't that a violation of her dignity?
Well, I agree with you, it is. And not only that, if that sort of thing starts happening, it radically reduces the likelihood that people are going to speak up and state their honestly held views. And that can't possibly be good for democracy. That would be my counter argument to Paul Morris.
Well, yeah, I mean, and this goes back to the kind of skepticism people like Stephen Price are showing about the hate speech laws, because they're basically saying, well, okay, there's all these protections. If it comes to court, it'll be very difficult to actually prosecute people for these kinds of ordinary speech. But we know that there's this sort of cultural movement that does see speech as violence, and as that billboard episode illustrated, people are willing to actually sort of go on the attack for these things. And even if it goes to court, and in the Maya Forstater case, it was appealed and then overruled. So then the lawyers might say, okay, well, it's fine. It just got overruled. That she's been acquitted. But not many people want to even go to one court case, right? It's very expensive. It's incredibly stressful. Your name is dragged through the mud. It's all over social media. And so most people are just going to try to avoid anything that comes close to that. And that's going to have an incredibly strong chilling effect on ordinary political discourse. And even at this point, it's the private conversations.
Well, and the whole Paul Morris argument, I mean, I think, to be fair to him, maybe he's coming very specifically from that religious perspective. But, the whole idea of not being able to participate in equality, right? This would be, or participate in democracy equally. This is way more chilling to democracy than someone throwing a anti-Semitic slur at me.
Mm. Yeah, the question there is really like, what is more chilling on public discourse? Is it people saying really mean things, or is it the threat of being put in jail for up to 3 years? Because that's basically what the government's saying with these new proposals. It's saying, by threatening to put people in jail for up to 3 years, if they incite hatred in a vague definition of hatred, which applies to an enormous number of groups, we are actually going to have a positive effect on the climate for free expression. It actually makes that argument that it's actually, with these proposals, it's actually attacking a chilling effect on speech that comes from sort of people saying mean things. So their contention is that threatening to put people in jail is going to have less of a chilling effect than people saying offensive things.
Yeah. I mean, I just think it's just a preposterous statements that they're making, really. It makes no sense to me whatsoever.
Dane, can I actually, I'm interrupting Michael, which is a bit ironic, because I actually wanted to go back briefly to something you said right at the beginning, and it's come up again a few times in what you've been saying. Because when you were talking about your punk rock band at the beginning, I mean, I know that Michael was also in a band for many years in Melbourne, and I was expecting him to take this up, but I could make a similar point. I mean, I did a tiny bit of acting back in the day at university, and it was reasonably kind of conservative milieu I was in, but it strikes me that not that long ago, even like 5 or 10 years ago, definitely 20 years ago, the actors and the media people and, the comics especially, they were all free thinkers. They were all free speech people. That was very much that environment. It was very much kind of a little bit provocative and sort of, iconoclastic. And that seems to have changed very quickly. Now it seems to be the case that the people who are engaged in cultural production are the most likely to sort of trip you up for cultural appropriation or whatever.
Yeah, no, that is the case. I think the thing with art is Alfred Hitchcock, right? So let's look at the film Psycho and really think about Psycho as a film. This is a film about a cross-dressing killer who thinks he's his mother, right? And he's obviously, there's a lot of Freudian stuff going on. There's voyeurism of a woman in a shower. There's the murder in the shower. This is 1960, right? So, it's easy for us to just see it today as just a really good horror or thriller. But Alfred Hitchcock, universally considered one of the greatest directors of all time, he would have been sitting in his office on the lot of whatever studio he was contracted to, thinking, how can I completely fuck people up? That's what he would have been thinking. What's the most perverse, in your face, shocking thing I can do and put it in a film and get it so people actually watch it, right? Then you go to Kubrick, and he wants to make a Clockwork Orange. Once again, Clockwork Orange, I showed my son, he's an adult now, but he watched it when he was about 18. And he was quite shocked by it. He was like, whoa, when was this made? 1971. Really? He couldn't get over that because, again, Kubrick must have sat down and thought, how do I just absolutely slaughter my audience and just absolutely shock them to the core? Martin Scorsese, Taxi Driver. Now, what do these guys have in common? They are the greats. We would call them the greats. Okay, let's look at comedians. Richard Pryor and his commentary on race and everything. You couldn't be more in your face for the day. Then you've got Joan Rivers, like really offensive. You've got Sam Kinison in the 80s, misogynistic, full on. You got the punk rock movement, which existed to offend. You've got heavy metalers. You've got the glam rock guys who were like alcoholics and drug addicts. And great art. Or even go back to D.H. Lawrence, right? I mean, there were court cases over Lawrence. It was porn.
That's right.
Back in its day, it was porn. Art has always been about really grabbing audiences. Well, great art has been about grabbing audiences by the shoulders and just shaking the living shit out of them.
And we might ask, I suppose, why, great art has to be like that. And I guess, my response to that, especially in terms of those movies you mentioned, Psycho and Clockwork Orange and Taxi Driver, what they're doing is actually exposing what Jung would call the shadow of us, the kind of worst that we can be, and the sort of dark morass of emotions and ideas that we don't like to delve into because it's too horrifying. But we have to go there if we want to actually prevent those things from playing out in reality. That's one of the insights of psychoanalysis that I think is really important. And in the case of those offensive comedians, they're really, tearing aside the veil on prejudice and misogyny and racism and laying it bare for everybody to see. And I guess humor is a way to do that allows it a pressure valve without it, becoming serious by definition. And it occurs to me, especially, and I'd be interested in your comment as a comedian, that comedy is actually in a state of existential threat at the moment with the degree of cancel culture that we have. If comedians have to be careful what they say, it's hard for me to see how they can operate at all.
Well, that's right. I think New Zealand has always been very conservative. We're a conservative country. We're a progressive country while being very, very conservative. Like I find in the writing, I've been quite lucky, really. Like I've got away with a lot of stuff. And I'm not really sure how I did that, but I did. There are tricks you can do. For instance, if I had a joke that I thought this is pretty blue, like it's going to grab a lot of heat and stuff, I would put just a completely unfilmable, disgraceful, disgusting joke about three jokes up on the page. So all the eyes would go to that joke, which I never wanted to be in there. I knew couldn't be in there. And then they'd say, oh, we had to take that out. And I'm like, oh, really? I quite like that one. And oh, it was terrible, Dane. What's the matter with you? And I'm like, oh, fair enough. And of course, they haven't seen the one that I smuggled in,
Yeah.
So I do that quite a bit. Comedy does have problems. there are some fantastic comedians around, like Dave Chappelle, Bill Burr, and people who are, I mean, surprise, surprise, they're the funniest, but they're almost too big to fail. Ricky Gervais is another one, he's sort of too big to fail now, and they're sort of holding the line, I think. I mean, if you look at film in the 70s, which was very raw coming out of Vietnam, and there was a lot of anti-heroes. It had the same energy that a lot of noir had. And of course, noir was really dealing with, all the protagonists in noir films are really damaged World War II soldiers, whether they state it or not. I mean, they're of that age. So, that's why they're drinking alcohol in a private eye's office in the middle of the day, because they were in the war. So that sort of darkness of the cultural moment permeated, film noir in the 50s as well. But then the 60s was kind of flat for film for quite a while, you had David Lean and people, but it wasn't great. We don't think about 60s films and probably until the end of the 60s, maybe it gets a little cool again, The 70s was another good explosion. The 80s, the 80s was, the yuppies came along, and Reagan was in power, and film got just a bit more simple. The complexity, Coming Home versus Rambo, two very different takes of Vietnam. I think all this stuff will come back. There'll be a restoration, period. But at the moment, there is. I mean, it's amazing what can get through still. But see, the thing that gets me really is there are funny people being funny, but they apologize, and you can't apologize for jokes. And what I find really troubling is that, for the sakes of their own careers, I mean, maybe the horse is bolted now, but they should have got together. All the agents, all the super agents in Hollywood should have had a meeting, and publicists, and they should have said, no, let's make a pact. No one apologizes for a single joke, because apologizing for a joke is like being the wildebeest with a limp who's going down to the watering hole, Like once you apologize for a joke, they're on you, man.
Well, once you apologize for anything at the moment, they tear you apart. There's no way back, is there? People just get cancelled anyway. James and I have sort of gone back and forth, and I waver a bit about, how long this censorious culture will persist. And it occurs to me that the attack on comedy is actually one source for hope, because I don't think people can stand it for that long when you're not allowed to laugh at things. And I think of the interregnum following the English Civil War and the Cromwell period, when they banned Christmas and basically joy of every kind for 10 or 12 years, and just how unpopular that made Cromwell, and how they couldn't wait to get back to a king who wanted to celebrate things again.
Yeah, I have a theory, and you guys, being way smarter than me, might be able to flesh it out a bit for me, actually. And that is that, when you look at music in the 1970s, say 69 to 79, right?
Yeah.
What do we got? We got psychedelic rock. We got the birth of heavy metal. We've got funk. We've got the punk rock, we've got disco, we've got electronica starting in Germany and so forth, Kraftwerk and everything by the end. There was so many, and then glam rock, David Bowie, Mark Bolan, T-Rex, there are, and then soft rock, you got the Eagles. I mean, there were so many musical styles and genres emerging in that period. And and I was a musician, like I said, and Michael, you were a musician as well.
I was in an experimental rock band. That wasn't until the 90s, really, in Melbourne. So that was part of the indie scene there.
Okay, yeah. Well, we were a glam rock band and sort of New York Dolls, like I said, is sort of punky. We'd get into fights and stuff on stage with people, and it was pretty chaotic and fantastic.
Yeah,
I got to say. But we haven't had a new form of music for a long, long time.
I completely agree with you, and I reflect on this quite often. I mean, there's still wonderful music being made, but it all harks back, doesn't it? It's all, recycling rather than something truly new, it seems to me. I mean, the last real kind of genre revolution that I can think of was techno in the early 90s, and that's 30 years ago.
Well, that's right. And I do wonder if the reactionary turn by a lot of our young, because it's reactionary, that's what it is because it's almost like akin to sexual frustration, not having a genre of music to come along and just completely captivate you like a parasite,
Yeah.
It's like the whole idea of the Bacchae and Dionysus. It's like, what's happening over on the hill?
I mean, I guess it's hard to separate cause and effect, isn't it? I'm not sure whether it's the censorious culture, which is, but then as we reflected, it's been 30 years, and the censorious culture is much newer than that. So I guess there is an argument there that some sort of lack of a kind of youthful, anarchistic, devil may care kind of movement with its music is partly to blame for the current malaise.
Yeah,
well,
I can't really comment on the genre thing because I don't really know as much as you guys about music. But I mean, I will say, just thinking of the last sort of few decades, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years in cultural history, maybe even back to the 1950s. I mean, it's interesting because I grew up mainly in the UK. So in the UK in the 90s, there were lots of television programs, which were basically kind of triumphalist liberal programs about how we won. Like the people who wanted to make rude jokes, they were the cool people in the 70s, and they eventually won, and weren't all those old conservative fogies kind of annoying. And so you'd have these things like there'd be retrospectives about Monty Python, and there'd be the famous interview where there was an Anglican bishop who was on TV with Monty Python telling them that they'd gotten their 30 pieces of silver for making the life of Brian. So in other words, saying to them, you are like Judas, you've betrayed Christ, and the whole sort of movement of cultural freedom in the 60s and 70s was to sort of mock that, because that was the establishment at the time. And there was very little sympathy for religious people from that perspective, right? And so you thought, well, okay, well that's obviously one, looking from the point of view of the 90s or the early 2000s, that point of view is one, and that will never be the case again. We'll never have this establishment, and everything will be free, And then instead, what's happened is that there's been this new establishment, and it's almost amazing to me how people just can't see this. That it's really a very, very similar set of beliefs. That some views are dangerous, jokes can be harmful, that kind of thing. It's the same set of beliefs from an elite. It's just a different elite, and now it's this progressive elite rather than this slightly Christian conservative elite.
But I was talking to Matt McCartan, the trade unionist and former Labour chief of staff, about this. It's like, should we keep calling these people progressive and even left wing? They're not really concerned with class struggle.
No,
they are closer to a conservative, and because my punk rock spirit remains in place, and the people that I was rebelling against 30 years ago, and the people that I'm rebelling against today, I think they're quite similar, like you pointed out.
There's a Puritanism about them. That's what unifies them to me. And like you, Dane, I mean, it sounds as if I'm a bit younger than you. I was at primary school during the height of the 70s punk revolution, but certainly, the musical scenes in which I moved in the late 80s and 90s had that spirit as well. That very kind of speak up and be heard, and not exactly revolutionary. We weren't that political, but certainly, and spiritually anarchic is how I'd put it. And that to me continues to underpin how I see things. And now I just feel so, this is so stultifying what's happening at the moment. It's so joyless and so unspiritual in a way.
Well, yeah, and I think that we're all being gaslit too, because what they're trying to say is that, that we are the orthodoxy, and we just don't like the fact that that our power is being threatened.
That's right. Yeah.
But that's gaslighting, because they're the conservatives. That they are the cultural conservatives.
And by any reckoning, they now have the cultural power. They control the universities. They control Hollywood.
Well, they are the rule
They control
makers.
the publishing industry. They control the media. What more do they want in terms of power?
Well, they're the ones making the rules. I'm not making rules for anyone.
No, that's right.
I mean, I don't like rules. Rules actually really upset me. I detest even books on how to write scripts. I'd rather write my own script and suck than have someone try to make money off me by telling me how to write a script, because all I would do is create the husk of a script. It wouldn't have the heart, because too many rules, so I'm not making rules for people. So it's the rule makers who are the ones that I think I would call conservatives. I think there's something really reactionary and conservative. I mean, because you bring up Monty Python. When I saw, in all due respect, and with the greatest respect to Professor Paul Morris, I couldn't help but think of that interview with, I think it was Malcolm.
It was Malcolm Muggeridge,
Muggeridge, and some other priests and clerics who were. Paul would probably think he was making a progressive argument, but I saw a dusty old man of the cloth, really.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when he got to the point where someone said, well, does it deal with hate? I've got a friend who's an imam, a Muslim imam, and he said, you've got to remember that hate speech are two different words. These laws will deal with speech. They won't deal with hate. That's not what they're doing. And Paul Morris's response to a question which sort of was tapping that idea was that, well, they're not really meant to address hate. What they're meant to do is just set up conditions for our society. We're setting up new conditions for our society. And I thought, bingo.
Yeah.
It's like, what gives you the right, man, to set up these new conditions? This is what it's all about. It's about top-down culture, And I rebel against that as a punk rocker, but I rebel against that also as a working class kid. See, the interesting thing about these laws, I was in South Auckland not too long ago. I was brought up in Otahu, and I was in Papatoi a couple of weeks back doing doing some writing for a show that's going to be set there. I got very nostalgic when I was there. So much diversity, and and me. Look, I got a Muslim son. I got an ex-wife who's Muslim. I got 3 children who are part Aboriginal. Indigenous Australians. So none of that. The walls have never mattered to me. I'm there. There's Samoans. There's a very healthy Muslim community. There's Maori. There's all sorts of people around. And I thought to myself, see, this area is going to be the place where the hate speech laws that people like Paul Morris would endorse will have no reach. Ironically, in the most multicultural areas, then they're just not even going to be on the radar. People aren't even going to know they exist, And I find that really ironic, because to me, if you think hate speech laws are a good idea, I would have to really interrogate that person to the experience that they even had of multiculturalism, like genuine multiculturalism. I wouldn't be surprised if many of them were raised in Meadowbank and didn't have a great grasp on it, hadn't lived and worked on a process line at Massport Panmure with a Muslim guy on one side and a Chinese guy on the other side of the process line, and then a Sri Lankan guy, and it's a job that's a little, sorry to throw you under the bus, Massport, but it's not the most invigorating, stimulating job, and so you're making each other laugh all day, and of course once you make people laugh or they make you laugh, you like them.
You become kindred in a way.
Yeah, and you do. You like them. You're all in the hustle. You're all in the struggle. They made you laugh. He's a good guy.
To go back to what we were reflecting on at the start. In many ways, this is perhaps why these, dare I say, elite liberals like to have a kind of monolithic narrative about particular minorities, perhaps because they don't know them very well, and therefore just want to see them through a particular lens that's easy for them to turn into the narrative they want, rather than actually, working on that production line at some point in their lives and understanding the actual people behind those identity labels.
Well, I would say that's exactly the case. I really, I'd be surprised if many of the people that I hear making these comments would have that lived experience of a neighborhood like South Auckland. I mean, Paul Spoonley, right, who I think is probably a bit more, look, I'm really giving Paul Morris a hard time. He just didn't strike me as terribly generous in that session that I saw, but I believe Paul Spoonley is wrong, but I think his heart is 100% in the right place. But he's made the comment a few times now that we probably need to think about these laws in respect to our changing demographic. And that's sort of an insult that cuts both ways, isn't it? Because what it's saying is that, when you bring people in from other countries, you sort of your own country needs to become a bit more illiberal, or else they won't be comfortable. But, what's that say about those people? It's a little bit tricky there. I don't like that. But it's also saying that you need protection against the people that are here. You need to be protected against them. So we're going to have to change the laws. You're going to lose a few rights and everything. It's going to be a little more illiberal than it was before, but it has to be that way. Well, what that says to me is, and I'd love to be able to confront him with this, is like, the subtext is a very clear cynicism towards multiculturalism as a concept. And I don't know how he'd take that if I said that to him. But
yeah, I'm sure he doesn't mean it this way, but the kind of line that he's arguing runs a risk of undercutting the cultural and political values that make multiculturalism possible.
That's exactly right. It's like, he's almost explicitly saying that multiculturalism won't work unless there's quite heavy-handed state intervention. I was brought up in one of the more diverse neighborhoods in New Zealand. We worked it out.
Yeah.
We had problems. There was conflicts at times. We broke off into groups and had fights, and then we were friends again. And then we borrowed each other's boats, and we went out and we went fishing and all of that. We drank a lot of booze, and stuff. But we worked it out. We worked it out, and there was a culture, and the culture wasn't dictated to us. We made the quilt together. We did it. We didn't have anyone back then imposing anything on us, which is what Paul Morris wants to do and sees as being the purpose of these laws. We didn't have that. We worked it out. We had to get along. We had the equalizer of poverty in a working class neighborhood. All our fathers got fired from the meatworks at exactly the same time when it closed down in the mid-'80s. So the grind is like an equalizer, and we had that. But, and the same goes for rural towns in New Zealand. It's like, why do these people at the top want to dictate culture? Why can't they just let it be?
That's a really good question. And it does unify them, as you alluded before, with the priests who were taking Monty Python to task. They seem to have a certainty in their own rectitude and a need to impose that on everybody.
Well, those guys in that cultural moment were extremely vulnerable, and they knew it. Like the priests on that show knew that they were losing.
They were losing
power,
their grip. Yeah,
losing their grip by the day. It was just sliding through their hands, and there wasn't much that could be done. And Life of Brian is just another wallop, and they're on the canvas again. So they're getting up and trying to get up again, but they've been knocked down 3 or 4 times. They've had the 60s. They've had now Life of Brian comes along. So there was a fear there in them that they were losing power. So I don't know what it is. I mean, Matt McCartan, who I interviewed on the Free Speech Union podcast, it's a good interview. People should check it out. Genuine left-wing perspective there. He'd tie it to the economic question, and I'm inclined to do that. It's like, we're not talking about class. We're not talking about the effects of neoliberalism. We're talking about words, and the wrong word put in the wrong sentence at the wrong time, and how you should be cancelled for that. And the other thing about cancellation, which is really anti-left wing, is that it has no respect for people's employment.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's sort of almost, I don't think it's, people sit down in a room and work this out, but, there's something so anti-left wing about going after a job and risking, the welfare of someone's family through employment. I can't help feeling that that's very kind of specifically part of the takeover, part of the move away from that economic question, a very vital component of moving the left, if we want to keep calling it that, I don't really want to, away from economic responsibilities to working class people.
I have another academic friend that I talked to about these issues, and we're always sort of harking back to what we see as a kind of golden age sort of free speech, or at least of balance. There was a sense in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, I think, that the very old Christian elite was definitely sort of that it didn't really have any power to dictate discourse anymore. But this new woke elite hadn't yet emerged, and it reminds me of, because I'm an ancient historian, I think it's Montesquieu. There's a later French writer who talks about the period the period between when the sort of old pagan religion started to weaken and when Christianity took over, as also a time for exploration and different philosophies like Epicureanism and Stoicism and things like that. But just to go back to this equality thing, I mean, if you read even Marxist historians like Eric Hobsbawm, they also look at the 70s and 80s as a kind of golden era. So 60s, 70s, and 80s is a kind of golden era. And that's because there's an incredibly high degree of equality in the developed West. And for a long time, if you're living through the 90s, again, it was one of those things that we sort of thought, we took this for granted and we thought it would just continue. And what we've seen in the last few decades is this huge upswing in inequality, precisely in the same countries, so especially in the English-speaking West, and New Zealand is a prime example of this after Rogernomics. And it's just very interesting to me that, so just as you get this huge upswing in inequality, there's also a downswing in freedom of speech. So I think these two things must go together, kind of citizen equality and the ability to kind of stand your ground, and the ability to also sort of have a say.
100%. I really do believe that. The way the housing crisis is going in New Zealand, half the population could be in shanty towns in 40 years. That might sound over the top or like I'm trying to oversell it, but I mean, I think it's highly possible, highly possible. But meanwhile, while this problem is here now and acute, we're talking about words and you know, and offending, you know, taking offense with political opinions and so forth. It just feels too convenient. And you know, like I said, I don't think people are sitting around in a room and plotting this out, you know. And I'd never go there, because as a Jew, plenty of people have written books about us sitting in rooms plotting things out. It's just not true. But you know, there is a, I don't know how people process it, but I do think it could be about guilt. If we want to get, you know, psychoanalytic, and what do you call it?
Psychoanalytic, yeah.
Analyze these people. I don't know how they process it, but you know, there's a real denial of the class struggle going on. Like, the left is just not interested. There was a tweet the other day from Andrew Little on the nurses turning down the government's offer, and why he thought it was a bad idea. Now, this is a guy that ran a union, and he had emojis with sunglasses and in the tweet and that, and it's like, he was just, it wouldn't have been him that tweeted it, I doubt, probably a younger person in his office, but they were sort of taking the piss and everything. We're talking about nurses. I mean, nurses have, I mean, some of the stuff they see in their job is horrendous. The stuff, well, on a daily basis, not some of the stuff. Every day there would be something that they'd rather no one would choose to see or have to deal with, you know. You would expect a left-wing party to deal with it. He sort of took the piss, or the person operating his Twitter account, you know, with crazy emojis and stuff. That interest in class struggle and what people are going through at the bottom, or in you know, really important jobs like nursing and teachers, it's just not there.
Well, in the UK, it seems as if the Labour Party has actively turned against the working class, and they've been punished for it as well electorally. But the whole cancel culture thing, especially in England, seems to really rub the working class up the wrong way. And there's very little at all coming out of the UK Labour Party that speaks to their concerns, it would seem.
No, and you know, the anti-Semitism.
That too, yes.
Yeah, of the Corbyn period is interesting, because there's a writer, Nick Cohen. You must have come across him. He writes for The Guardian and different newspapers. He's very, very good.
Yeah.
You know, he made the point, and he's correct. All reactionary movements have an anti-Semitic sort of element to them, because anti-Semitism is just extremely handy for embedding reactionary ideas.
Why do you think that is? I mean, that's an interesting point to make. And you know, perhaps I don't understand it as well as I should. I read a few years ago Hannah Arendt's book called The Origins of Totalitarianism. And she spent the first couple of chapters in that distinguishing racism against Jews from anti-Semitism as such. And I found that an interesting distinction, because it's not one that I'd come across before. But why do you think that anti-Semitism is something that reactionary movements resort to, even when it's not in a country or a polity where there are a lot of Jewish people, or they seem to be very influential?
Yeah, look, it's a hard one. Maybe because Jews have often been portrayed as conspiratorial and behind the scenes, and potentially, you know, I mean, what does Jesus represent for many Christians? Well, a utopian vision. And who undermined him? You know, the Jews. The Jews were undermining the utopian vision. I'm not saying that's the case, but I mean, is that an element to it? I mean, the invisible hand.
It's hard to see that it would be much of an element now, when Christianity has really fallen away as a.
But it's interesting you say that, because as someone that reads a lot of, you know, who, you know, has my eyes open to this stuff and is really looking. When I say looking for it, it's like, you know, I see a lot of old tropes that are sort of repackaged But like a really good example is like Gaza, right? Like when stuff happens in Gaza, when there's operations in Gaza, yeah, there are civilian casualties. There's no doubt about it. But a lot of anti-Israel people will really sort of, couch it in Jews wanting to go after children, wanting the blood of children, wanting specifically to target children. Like, I mean, that's it's almost just a repackaging of the blood libel.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting. I mean, it could be a coincidence, but it does make me wonder, and I wouldn't have been inclined to think this, but, yeah, I mean, I guess back to Jung, are there certain archetypes that just are in the DNA that we're passing down? I mean, it's...
Well, one interesting thing, I mean, I think that there's this, I mean, you obviously looked into this and have more experience and immediate and urgent interest in it than me, but there's the old stuff, but there's also this new stuff. And I think that the new anti-Semitism, a lot of it to me seems to be sort of codependent on these theories of intersectionality, that you can rank people according to how oppressed they are. And in some ways there's some truth in that, but it can very often become too rigid. And somewhat surprisingly, even though, considering what's happened to Jews in human history, you'd think that they would be, seen as one of the people that have been most commonly victimized, which is true. But somewhat surprisingly, they tend to be at kind of the top of this. They tend to be seen as because often they've been quite successful. I mean, I know it risks there of more stereotyping that, I think they're sort of hoarding gold or something, but, because often in countries they do reasonably well, I think there's this tendency to sort of say, now there's this whole thing about, they're the new white people, or they're also like white people.
They're almost hyper-white people.
Sorry?
Almost hyper-white people.
Yes, there's a term hyper-white as well. Yeah, I've seen that.
And, see, that's an interesting thing, because it's like, I mean, this to me really, I mean, the Jewish question here really highlights for me just how skin deep a lot of this identity politics is, because they can look at a Jew and say, well, this person has fair skin, so they've got privilege, almost like reading a color chart. But if you look at actual stats for violence, violence against Jews in America is higher than Muslims, but than it is against Muslims. And in Europe too, I believe. I know it has been in some countries, so I won't say for all countries, because Islamophobia is definitely a problem. But, there are stats that would indicate that Jews are being victimized at times by hate crimes. And, it would you would think that an anti-racism campaigner would be interested in that and wanting to maybe comment on that or do something about that, but they don't. And because I thought, well, I can't think what else, just this very literally skin deep reading of what a Jew is.
Yeah, we had a really interesting episode in my own field, classics, where there was a critical race theorist who was elected to the head of the American Society for Classical Studies. And then she tweeted, I looked it up so I don't get the wording wrong. She was saying, for 2 days, I've been suppressing anger about how one WW Jewish classicist shifted attention away from my interview with calls for a blog post on another Jewish WW. This woman always does this to me, sick and tired of it. So WW there stands for white woman. So I don't like the whole cancel culture thing. I'm not gonna name this person, but there was concern in the classicist community. Some people even commented below the tweet, why have you can complain about someone online. Why have you identified this person as Jewish? How is that relevant? But it's interesting to me how it goes together with WW, right? So it's kind of like white, women, Jewish. That's all in the same category. So yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's appalling behavior, isn't it? That is racism. it's a bit like calling a Jew a Zionist to get around saying Jew, or just saying Jew, but then, having the WW at the end of it to sort of soften it and say, oh, what I really meant was, or it was in the context of. But, never in a million years would I get on Twitter and say, this Sri Lankan so-and-so. Who does that?
Yeah, I know.
I mean, who does that?
Well, the full professor, apparently. So that's the world we're in. Okay, so we've actually gone for a bit more than an hour already. I don't mean to cut it. It's such an important conversation to cut short, but I wonder, Dane, if I could just in closing get you to talk briefly about the Free Speech Union, because we have had Patrick Corish on before, back when it was the Free Speech Coalition. So if people are sympathetic to what you've been saying and they're interested in fighting this new culture of sort of telling people what to say and what they can't say, what is the Free Speech Union? Can it help you? Can you help it, etc.? Okay,
well, the Free Speech Union, we started as the Free Speech Coalition. Well, I didn't start it. I came on a bit later on. And initially, it was created to address the public venues issue, which, the coalition took a lot of flack for, because, those YouTubers are not people that I would personally, full screen, get a cup of cocoa, put my feet up and watch. Let's put it that way. But, 2-3 years later, feminists are being ejected from these buildings, and we could see where that was going. We could see that was coming up. So it was important that they did that for the sake of every single person too, for the sake of climate change activists, anyone that wants to hire one of these public venues and should have a right to. So as the years went on, only a couple of years, but as the years went on, it became quite clear that workplaces were having an issue, and unions, traditional unions, weren't really rising to this challenge. A little bit like, my corridor about the Human Rights Commission and how they were sort of turning a blind eye to actual human rights abuses. The unions weren't really stepping up. Not saying all of them, but generally they didn't really want to touch this stuff. So the decision was made to sort of start developing policy and an apparatus to be able to go into workplaces and just make sure that people, are protected, following the letter of the law. Obviously, it's like if you're in a work uniform, spraying a whole lot of racist stuff on your computer, you should be fired. I mean, it's like you can't just bring a company into disrepute like that. So there are, we can't protect every single person. We're very careful to really test the facts of all these cases. But along with the campaigns like what we're doing at the moment, our concerns about hate speech laws, we are moving more into employment. And I would hope that we would start eventually even looking at policy. A big one for me, as someone from a minority community, is I've been reaching out to a lot of the Muslim community and lots of other communities. And, there's as much concern there. People aren't singing from the same song sheet necessarily. And I think we're missing opportunities to find real useful alternatives to bigotry. These laws are potentially taking oxygen and funds from that fight. So I'd like to look at policy eventually that can, and initiatives that could maybe even, show people that there are other ways and more effective ways to counter bigotry and racism. So that's a union. So, the more people who join us, the more strength we'll have. We've defended a few people now. Some of it we can't disclose. Councils are interesting beasts. Local government, they can be a little naughty, those councillors. So a few of them have, had their knuckles rapped by us. And we've had wins. We've had wins, which is important. And they're wins that ultimately serve absolutely everyone, even if we do have opponents who say, oh, why did he defend that person? The person who criticizes us today could be the person we're defending tomorrow, because it's a principle, and that's something that I wish more people would appreciate. But, this is where we are.
Yes, those who call for censorship today could well be on its receiving end tomorrow. Thank you for joining us, Dane. It's been a terrific conversation, and it's covered a lot of different ground. And all the very best for the good fight here. I suspect it will go on for a while.
That's right. So I didn't give the people our website. So www.fsu.nz/join would be nice. But go to the website, check it out, and
we'll post a link. We'll post a link on the recording of this.
Not only that, we've also scheduled our next episode is going to be with Jordan Williams, who's very much involved with the Free Speech Union. So we'll talk more about the Free Speech Union and how exactly it might be able to help you if you're worried about some of these issues and are listening to this podcast. But
he'd be well placed to unpack that a lot more. Yeah.
Yeah. But thank you very much, Dane, for that. That's a really, really interesting perspective. And thanks for coming on.
No problem. Thank you.